background, and everyone else can more clearly hear our speaker from Boley. With that, we'll get rolling. My name is Nick Batts. I'm the director of the Oregon Broadband Office. Nice to see all of you. Thank you for joining us on short notice. My apologies, we couldn't give more lead time, but this came together very, very quickly, and to ensure that all of you had a chance to incorporate what you've heard today into potential BDP applications, I wanted to make sure we got this meeting scheduled and happening as quickly as possible. So thanks to all of you who were able to join in a quick turnaround. Much appreciated. I think you'll find this conversation very helpful. This is by no means a requirement. This is more of just this is a new prevailing wage is a new area for a lot of us, and I wanted to give all of you the opportunity to hear directly from the experts at Boley. Those are the folks that we've been directing you to. Anytime prevailing wage comes up, I'm going to continue to direct you to Boley. Anytime you have questions around prevailing wage. This presentation, I understand, is ordinarily 3 hours long, but I didn't think many of you'd show up if I said that ahead of time. And Susan Woolley, who is from Boley and who's going to be walking you through her presentation, has graciously cut it down to about 50 minutes. So maybe even shorter than that, so we have time for questions. With that, I will hand things off to Susan.
Thank you, Dick. I'm happy to do the full 3 hours if anybody wants to hang out that long, but you know, we'll try to keep it to about 50 minutes or so. So my name is Susan Woolley. I'm the Prevailing Wage Rate Technical Assistance Coordinator with Boley. So part of what I do is give these webinars to contractors and public agencies and anybody around Oregon who is interested in our prevailing wage rate laws. So I'm going to share my screen with you. And just to double check, everybody can see that, right? Okay, cool. Thank you. All right. Well, the things I wanted to cover today is a little bit about the basics of prevailing wage and some information on coverage. So which types of projects are subject to these prevailing wage rate laws. And we're really going to focus on the special types of what we call public-private projects that I think your companies will probably be working on. And then there's a list of contractor responsibilities, and that's the part that usually takes about 3 hours to get through, but I've really cut it down. So we're just going to hit the high points there. But I'll give you lots of resources where you can find information on the website, plus contacts where you can reach out to us at Boley down the road. So these prevailing wage rate laws, they've been around in Oregon since 1959, so they've been around for a while. The legislature does tend to tweak them throughout the year, so they change a little bit as time goes by. And they were based on the federal Davis-Bacon Act when they were first passed. Our laws don't have a name like the Davis-Bacon Act. We just call them the state prevailing wage rate laws, although sometimes you might hear them referred to as the Little Davis-Bacon Act or the Baby Davis-Bacon Act. My favorite was a contractor who kept calling them the Kevin Davis-Bacon Act. And so however they want to refer to it, those are the federal laws, a little bit different than the state laws, but there's a lot of similarity there too. And of course, once a project is subject to these state prevailing wage rate laws, the laws will apply equally to every contractor who's out there working on that project. And the prevailing wage rates that you'll find in our rate books, those are the minimums that have to be paid to the workers. If you've ever looked up a rate in the rate book, you'll see it's made up of a base rate plus a fringe rate, and it's the combination of those two that gets paid to the worker. And we'll take a look at our rate book so you can kind of get a feel for how to look up those rates. If you've ever wondered why in the world do we have these prevailing wage rate laws, well, the legislature actually put it into statute for us. So they said, well, we want to pass these laws because, first of all, we want to protect our local competition. So we're going to even the playing field. So everybody's bidding on equal footing for the kind of work that they do. And the hope is that our local contractors will be more competitive than contractors who come from outside of the state. And the hope, too, that second bullet says promote local participation. So we hope these local contractors have local employees working on those projects, which is a good way to help that public money stay there in the community. And then, of course, they said we want to encourage training of workers, which would be through apprenticeship programs. And finally, to encourage contractors to provide benefits for their workers, to pay for things like medical insurance and provide vacation time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. So I do see a good question that says, if we use house unionized staff, are those construction workers exempt? No, they are still going to be subject to the prevailing wage rate laws. So they're probably, as a union worker, chances are they're probably paid a little bit higher than prevailing wage already, but you'd want to double check that and make sure. Every once in a while, there'll be a union rate that might be less than prevailing wage. It's rare, but it does happen. And then all the other requirements would apply too, like the certified payroll reports that we're going to talk about. So they'd have to show up on those as well. That's a good question. Thank you for asking that. So for coverage, for a project to be subject to these state prevailing wage rate laws, that project must meet the definition of this term, public works. And that is a statutory definition. So ORS stands for Oregon Revised Statutes. Those are the statutes that the state legislature writes. And this is the number for the definition of that term, public works. This is a pretty long definition. The only two pieces of it that I'm going to talk about this morning are parts A and B, but it goes on to parts C, D, E, and F. So kind of keep in mind, this is not the only type of public works project that you might ever come across, but these will be the most common, I think, that you might see. This first one, this is the part of the definition that's been around the longest for public works. And this is a more typical kind of public works project that you would probably think of. It's any kind of construction, reconstruction, major renovation or painting, or demolition or removal of hazardous waste that's being carried on or contracted for by a public agency to serve the public interest. So that demolition and removal of hazardous waste piece, that was just newly added to the definition with this last legislative session. So that's a new piece for us. But these are the types of typical, a new high school gets built. That's a big public works project that's going to be subject to the prevailing wage rate laws. They can be smaller projects too, though. I have an example here of like a city hall has a leaky roof that needs to be repaired. And so they might issue a maintenance contract to do that, but that's reconstruction of that roof. And it's being done by a public agency, by the city. So that's going to be a public works project. Things like patching potholes on the neighborhood streets, those are going to be subject to the prevailing wage rate laws too. And even something like wetland restoration, where they might be replacing culverts or even log dams. We've had those questions come up too. Those are all considered construction or reconstruction projects.
From a process standpoint, don't have to spend much time on that.
So
Folks,
somebody's,
please make sure you
No,
muted
this
your
is
phones
amazing.
or your computers, please.
You have other reasons that you don't want to
Thanks,
contribute.
Nick.
Um,
Okay, there we go. Cool. Thank you. So part B then of this definition of public works, I think this is the focus of this morning's questions probably. It says it's again construction, reconstruction, major renovation or painting, demolition or hazardous waste removal. In this case, the project will use $750,000 or more in funds of a public agency. So there's no public agency who's contracting for any kind of work. It's just a public agency says, here's money that we have available. They grant it, sometimes they loan it. And it's just that dollar figure amount that ends up being the trigger for the prevailing wage rate laws. You will probably hear me say those are public-private projects. That's the kind of term that we've given these types of projects, where they're usually privately owned. But they're public in the sense of all the public funds that are being used for that project. And some examples of that. The ones that we have, but Boley has seen most often, have been private nonprofit groups who get grants or loans from public agencies. And it could be something like renovation of an historic building. And again, it's just because of that dollar figure that's subject to prevailing wage. We see a lot of mixed use developments where there's affordable housing with commercial spaces within that building. And again, if that uses at least $750,000 of public funds, that's going to trigger the prevailing wage rate laws for that project. And then the last one is probably very similar to the types of work that your companies might be doing, where there might be a grant of at least $750,000 to install broadband infrastructure. We'd say that's a construction project, so that's using at least $750,000 for that work. That would trigger the prevailing wage rate laws then for that project. And let me know, I just wanted to pause a minute to see if anybody has any questions so far about this piece of coverage, what the trigger is for these laws. We can always come back to it if you think of something later. Well, once you have this coverage in place, then the next step is knowing all of the requirements that are in place for contractors who are working on these types of projects. The first one, it's a public works bond. That's a $30,000 bond that needs to be filed by anybody who's required to pay prevailing wage. So we usually say contractors and subcontractors have to file that, but sometimes some businesses will say, well, I'm not really a contractor on the project, but if they have workers performing labor on that public works project, they'll have to pay prevailing wage to those workers, which means they will need to file this public works bond. And I know it's a little bit odd that it's filed with Construction Contractors Board because it has really nothing to do with CCB. It's only for prevailing wages. BOLI's the only one that can file against that. And it's really just to ensure that those workers do get paid appropriately. So I have some links through here, and Nick, were you able to provide people with the handouts that we're using this morning? If not, I can always.
Yeah, I don't believe so, Susan. If you want to get
Okay.
those to me again, I'll get them to everyone afterward.
Okay, no problem. So I have a PDF of this version that I think the links are still working on this, but I just wanted to show you in the Construction Contractors Board. So you can see here, there's this information about a public works bond. And they tell you how to file it. If a company does not have a CCB license, but they have to pay prevailing wage, they still have to file this public works bond. And CCB has a special non-construction company form to fill out in that case. And there are some exemptions from the bond requirement. There's more information about that on the BOLI website, and I'll show you where you can find that. The next thing is that if you award any subcontracts on a public works project, there's some specific language that has to be in that subcontract. And it could be that it's not as a formal multi-page subcontract. Maybe you call out somebody to work for you over the phone and say, hey, I need this, or maybe you do it through a purchase order type of a thing. At a minimum, you need to have these two provisions in writing. So one is to let them know what the applicable rates are for that project. And the other is a provision that says all your workers on this project, they have to be paid those, not less than those applicable prevailing wage rates. So it's fine to always pay, or it is fine to pay more than prevailing wage. Like the question that Christina had asked about the union staff, they probably are already getting paid more than prevailing wage, and that's absolutely okay. You just can't pay less than that prevailing wage rate. And so you need to let your subcontractors know that so they're aware. Another requirement is that you post the applicable rates somewhere on that project site. And I know this is a struggle sometimes for companies. There's not always a great place to post on project sites, especially when it's a project like this that might be running over miles of land. So you might have to be creative. Once upon a time, back before I knew better, I said, well, just take the rates, type them up on a piece of paper and nail it to a tree somewhere. And then I found out eventually that's really bad. You can't put anything on trees on public property, so that's not an option. But I did have a contractor give me a great example where they take their letterhead, they type up the rates on their letterhead, and it is good to have the company name on it so you can clearly show this is our posting. We are in compliance with this requirement. And then this particular company, they laminated it and they stuck it to the outside of the company vehicle with magnets. So it was a great way to get it on the project site. And as the workers moved along the site, the truck would move with them and therefore the rates would move with them too. So that's an idea if you are not quite sure about how to post or where to post. The important thing is that it's somewhere that's conspicuous and accessible for the workers. The workers need to be able to find it. And because we do update our rates 4 times throughout the year, sometimes it's hard to know exactly which rates are applicable for the project. For these types of public-private projects, where they're privately owned, but they use $750,000 or more in public funds, the applicable rates are those that were in effect when that public agency first entered into an agreement with the private entity. So usually we're going to see that something like a grant agreement. When that grant agreement, on the date it's executed, whatever rates are in effect on that day, then those would be the rates that you would use for that project. And so let's talk a little bit more about our rate books and paying that right rate. If you need help with how to classify workers, well, first, actually, let's take a look at the rate books. So this is on the BOLI website, and you can see all the rates that we published over the past several years. So generally speaking, in most years, you'll see the big rate books come out on January 5th and July 5th of each year. And then we usually have 2 amendments. There's an April 5th amendment, and that will amend some of the rates from the January book. And then you'll see the October 5th amendment, which updates some of the rates from the July book. So it's usually those 4 dates. Every once in a while, we find something that needs to be corrected, and there'll be an off-date amendment, but that's kind of rare, fortunately. So let's say that you were to get a grant of $1 million to install this broadband infrastructure, and the grant agreement was signed on, well, how about we'll say June 1st. So June 1st is going to be the applicable date then for the rates for that particular work that's going to be done. And that means that would use the July 5th rate book plus the April 5th amendment. I'll show you what the rate books look like. You scroll through, there's some introductory information in the beginning. And then we dive into our rates. So we have a lot of different classifications, as you can see. And you want to find the classification that's the best fit for the work that's being done. And then you'll see there's the rate listed, and there's a base rate plus a fringe rate. If you're not quite sure about the classification, I'm going to go back to my slides here. That's where you want to use BOLI's definitions of covered occupations book. And this book, also on the BOLI website, lists all those same classifications that we saw in the rate book, and then it tells you what the typical duties are that fall under all of those classifications. And the nice thing about this book, it's about 2/3 of the way down. It's a long book. There is a cross-reference section. So here in this section of the book, it lists all the different duties alphabetically and then tells you which classification to use. So I think probably a lot of you would be using, since installing fiber optics. So let me get down to the F's here. Can you see that okay? Is that too small? So here's the fiber optics cable installation. That's the limited energy electrician. So that would be the classification that you'd use for that. You might also have excavators or something along those lines. You can see here's excavators, and it's under the power equipment operator classification, and they do have group numbers, and that group number is going to vary depending on the size of the excavator that's used. So this definitions book is going to be a helpful resource for you to figure out how to classify those workers. Oh, a couple of good questions. Christina said regarding the public works bond, is it only the awarded provider who files the bond, or any vendors we hire who may also hire subcontractors also required to file? Good question. It's anybody who has to pay prevailing wage. If the company is required to pay prevailing wage, they must file that public works bond with CCB. And that would be a good thing to share with them too. I mentioned those two provisions. Back here about letting them know the applicable rates and telling them they must pay not less than the prevailing wage rate. But you might also tell them as well, by the way, you also need to file this public works bond with CCB. That's if they don't already have one. If they have a public works bond in place, that one bond covers all the work they do for any PWR project. So if they do already have one, that's awesome. They don't have to worry about it. But if they don't, then yeah, they would need to go ahead and file that. And Keith said a question about scope. If a project proposes that a component will be paid with matching funds, privately funded, and will be continued work beyond the payout scope of the grant, does the prevailing wage apply to that component? That is nuanced. The PWR law, there's part of the statute says you cannot divide up a project, and there are a whole list of factors that we would look at in those cases. So there is a potential, because that statute does also say, well, maybe in some cases, if it's appropriate, you can divide it to separate the parts that use public funds from the parts that don't use public funds. So that's a possibility, but I have to say it's probably not very likely. If that is a scenario that's going to come up for you, what I would suggest is submitting a coverage determination to BOLI to let us know, here's the situation, this is the part that will use public funds, this is the part that will not use public funds, and then ask us, can we do that separation there? And I realize one thing I don't have a link for is the coverage determination process. So this is the BOLI website, oregon.gov/BOLI. If you've never been there, this is what it looks like. To get to the prevailing wage page, it's not completely obvious, but you'll see this little tab here that says wages. And if you click on, should I be getting the prevailing wage? That takes you to the PWR homepage. And so from here, you can get to all of these links that I'm going to this morning. One of them is this link for coverage determinations. So when you click on that, well, this first link, this takes you to the table of all the determinations we've issued over the past several years. There's quite a few of them. I don't think we've had any that I can remember that are exactly like the projects that you guys will be working on. But you can always request a determination for that. And then up here, it says learn more about making a request. So if you click on that, that gives you the details on how to submit that request. So we would love to get that from you. We have so many of these that sometimes it's a struggle to keep up with them, but that's really the best way to tell, especially as you mentioned, those are kind of nuanced situations. So those are the best types to come to us to ask for help with that coverage determination. And Mark had asked, does limited energy electrician apply to work done in the public right of way as opposed to in a building? Oh, it could be either. the issue is if it's that low voltage amount. So it could be phone lines that are put inside a building. That is usually going to be a limited energy electrician, or the data cabling that runs through the building. So it could also be out in the wild for this type of broadband installation too. Okay, so let's see, which one of these is my right book? There we go. So just so we can take a look at it, I'm going to scroll down to the limited energy electrician piece of it. Come on. There we go. Now, limited energy electrician is one of those classifications that has different areas around the state. So you'd find first your reference county, the county where that work is being done. If your work was being done in Lynn County, this would fall under Area 3, and that would be the rate that you would use. Well, I should say, if the January 5th rate book was the correct rate book to use for the project that you're working on. So you can see different counties for different areas. Then, oops. Okay, I'll just start back here again. So this is again that PW homepage, which is probably a good page to bookmark if that's helpful for you. Looking at the prevailing wages once again. So remember, we have this April 5th amendment, and that April 5th amendment does update the rates from the January book. It doesn't change every weight, but I happen to know that this one did change. I think, did I remember that correctly? Oh, it didn't change limited energy electrician. It only changed electricians. Okay, so never mind. Well, that would be a good thing to look at though. If you know, say that your grant agreement was executed July 30th or earlier, then that project would use the rates from the January rate book plus the April amendment. So if you start with the April amendment to look for your classifications, and if you don't see any classifications listed there that you're going to use, then you can ignore the amendment from that point forward and just simply go back to the January 5th rate book. I'm assuming there'll probably be other grant agreements that are issued and go into effect after that date, probably using then the July rate book, and then maybe some that will even use the October amendment, depending on when those grant agreements are executed. So just try to keep in mind that we have typically these scheduled rate publications, and whatever date that agreement was entered into between that public agency and the private entity, that's going to set the date for the rates that you should be using on that project. Are there any questions about that? And again, I'm happy to go back if we need to. Oh, that's a great question. Gus asked, what is Boley seeing for average adjustment quarter to quarter this last couple of quarters? We don't really try. I mean, it's a great question, but I actually don't have an answer for you. The rates in the rate books are based solely on the union rates. So as the union rates increase, that's when we increase our rates as well. I shouldn't put it quite that way, because sometimes the union rates will increase, but that rate increase doesn't get reflected until the next scheduled publication. So sometimes there's a little bit of a delay in it, but that's what you'll see in those amendments that come out in April and October. Those are the union rates that have changed since the January or July book. So then we show that increase that comes out in the amendment. And the requirement is that all workers on the project have to be paid the appropriate prevailing wage rate. And a worker, that I put that in quotes because that is a defined term in rule. It's anybody who's performing manual labor on the project site. So their work is manual or physical in nature, as opposed to mental or managerial type work. So it's those workers who are out there that have to be paid the appropriate prevailing wage. And they get paid according to the duties that they're performing, not what their title might be. And that's where that, again, that definitions book comes into play, where you'd look for the duties that are being performed, and then that's the classification that you would pay them at. As we saw in the rate book, these rates are made up of a base rate plus a fringe rate. And this full amount needs to be paid to the worker in some way. Some contractors pay this full base plus fringe directly to the worker as wages, and that's absolutely fine to do. Usually we see that with a non-union contractor. For union contractors, the way their agreements work, they have to pay this full fringe amount into a union trust plan. So you don't even have to worry about it. It just goes into the union trust, and the union trust distributes it as appropriate, and you pay the base rate only to the worker. But then for the non-union contractors, some of them contribute to certain benefits for the workers. So they pay for things like medical insurance, they offer vacation pay, they might contribute to retirement plans. Well, as long as those plans meet certain criteria and the contributions to those plans meet certain criteria, that's what this bona fide part means, then the company can actually count that benefit contribution as part of the prevailing wage rate. We call it taking a credit against the prevailing wage rate, and there's some math that has to be done for that. Basically, again, this is a pretty high level overview. You would take the total contribution amount for that person for that pay period, and you would divide it by all the hours that person worked in that pay period. So for example, if I paid $500 a month for my employee's medical insurance, and in that month, let's say the employee worked 100 hours, and that's total hours worked, both prevailing and non. So 500 contribution divided by 100 hours worked, my fringe credit is $5 an hour. So if I go back and look at my fringe rate, I can subtract $5 from that because I'm paying that. I'm just paying it in the form of this nice benefit. So that's fine to do. And there's more information about those fringe credits and what the requirements are in our PW Laws handbook. This was the other resource I wanted to point out to you, that it's a long book, it's 209 pages, but it has a lot of good information in it. I think the most helpful part will be this section here on contractor responsibilities. And then we also have Appendix A, which is the part that talks about computing that hourly fringe credit amount. So this might be another thing you want to bookmark to help with these kind of questions. Okay. Oh, yes, I can drop those links in the chat. Just trying to think of the best way to do that. If you can believe it, we're doing great on time. I think there's only a couple more slides left, and then I'll just stick all those links into the chat at that point. So another responsibility that every contractor and every subcontractor has, and again, it's anybody who has to pay prevailing wage, they have to prepare certified payroll reports. So these are certain forms that have to be filled out by the contractor that shows all the work that's being done by their workers on that PWR project. And they're prepared on a weekly basis for any week that they have workers on that project. They are only submitted once a month, though, to the public agency, and that's because, according to Oregon law, employers can pay monthly if they want to. They can pay more frequently than that, but not less frequently than once a month. And so these reports, they still have to be prepared weekly, but if the contractor hasn't had their payroll yet, they can't sign it to say it's all true. So that's why they're submitted once a month and they're turned in by the 5th business day of that following month. For these types of projects, these public-private projects, the reports get turned in to the public agency that is providing that funding. So in this case, it would be that business organ, the office, broadband deployment program office. And BOLI has a form that you're welcome to use. We call it the WH-38 form. Like this. You can use whatever form you want though. And as long as whatever form you use includes all the same information as BOLI's form. So if you don't already have a software program for this, you might as well just use the BOLI form. It'll be probably easier for you. And there is this second page, fill in all this information and sign it saying, I have read the certified statement, know the contents thereof, and it is true to my knowledge. That's what makes it certified, is somebody saying, yes, in fact, this is true. Now you might notice we've added some information regarding the Federal Davis-Bacon Act. So that's the information over here on the right side. If the work is subject to the Federal Davis-Bacon Act, in addition to the state laws, you'd fill out this half. I think that, well, I guess I shouldn't say for sure because I don't work for U.S. Department of Labor, so I can't speak for them. But it was my understanding that most of these ARPA funds that are out there being used don't have Davis-Bacon requirements attached to them. So if that's the case, you wouldn't have to fill out this second half of the form. You just fill out the left-hand side. And then we also have instructions on the website for how to complete the form, how to fill in all the blanks on it. Ooh, couple good questions. Okay, so who is authorized to sign the form? It's a little bit different between state and federal law, but as far as BOLI is concerned, anybody can sign it who can say this information is true. If they know that I have read the certified statement, I know the contents and they're all true, anybody who can say attest to that can sign it. So a lot of times we see it's the payroll person who's signing these and turning it in. Sometimes the payroll people are more confident with the employer signing it. So either way, it doesn't matter for BOLI as long as they can say that, yeah, that is true. And then Christina asked if there's a portal where payroll can be uploaded. Not that I know of. Nick, have you guys talked about receiving certified payroll? Is there a preference for how you might want to get it?
No, Susan, we're on the front end of learning about all of this as well. So
Okay.
We'll bring our payroll and our finance team into this conversation once we have a little more time.
Okay. I think usually it's contractors just email it, or sometimes they just mail in hard copies, the old-fashioned way. Let's see. Does the employer certify or does the grant awardee certify? It would be, it would be well, I was kind of thinking the employer would also be the grant awardee, but if that's not the case, it's the employer who's going to certify. So whoever it is that is writing the checks for these workers, they should be the one to sign this form to say, yep, this is true. I paid all my employees the prevailing wage rate. And then the next question says, U.S. Treasury guidance, only projects awarded over, over 5 million require prevailing wage. That must be some kind of federal thing that I'm not familiar with. But yeah, so for the state law that we're talking about, we have a much lower threshold. If the project cost is less than $50,000, the state prevailing wage rate laws don't apply. So these projects costs will be far in excess of that because they have to use $750,000 or more in public funds to have the prevailing wage rate laws apply. So yeah, that U.S. Treasury guidance wouldn't apply in this case because these are the state laws instead of the Federal Davis-Bacon Act. Great questions you guys have. Well, you do want to keep all your certified payroll. The law does require that you keep them for 3 years, and you need to keep the backup documentation to prove what's on that certified payroll is correct, just in case questions could come up. And again, that's for 3 years as well. We do say, it's not a bad idea to keep the records for longer than that, because there is no statute of limitations for wages owed. So if you did have a worker who comes, 5 years from now and says, look at all my fabulous documentation that I have proving I wasn't paid prevailing wage. If you don't have documentation to offset that, that could end up being an issue for you. So it's just a consideration. You might want to keep these records for longer than the 3-year period required by law. Oh, James, that's a good question. James said, are waivers available for preparing weekly certified payroll reports if we pay every other week? Well, no, you still have to prepare them weekly, but you don't turn them in until the end of the month. Well, actually, the 5th business day of the following month. So for each time you turn in your reports, you'll have, if the employees worked every day in that month, you'd have 4 weekly reports that you'd be turning in by the 5th business day of the following month. I am going to, sorry, bear with me. I'm going to pull up an example certified payroll report. So this has the information filled in, and I just wanted to focus in on this gross amount and deductions and net pay here. So I've got my example employee who worked for 3 hours at a rate of $30 an hour. So in column 7 here, there's this line across it, and it does say see directions. So all this information is in the instructions form. In the top half of 7, you would show the gross amount owed just for this project, just for this week. So that 3 hours work times the $30 an hour, that's a gross of 90. And then once the pay period is all done, so my example pay period here, we can see it's a 2-week pay period from February 4th to the February 17th. So when that pay period is all done, I'm going to fill in the bottom part of 7 with the full gross for the entire pay period. And then I'll show the full deductions for that entire pay period and the net wages for that entire pay period. So it's just a matter of pulling over the payroll numbers and inserting them here into the certified payroll report form. The payroll reports, are they based on wages paid or hours worked? Well, so it's both. So like in this case here, you would show this week's hours worked and you would show their gross amount earned. But until that pay period is over, you couldn't fill in the total net wages paid until that pay period is over. So you're going to have this first week's report. So you said if you paid every 2 weeks. So the first week in that 2-week pay period, it's going to be in limbo a little bit until you hit the second week done, the pay period is done, and then you go back and fill in the first week, that information for the gross for the pay period, the deductions and the net for the pay period, and then you'll show that same information on the second week in that pay period. I hope that makes sense. I know none of it really makes sense, but I hope it's clear. I should put it that way. Let's see, did I get all the questions? If I missed one, shout out to me so I can scroll back up there and see. Ooh, there's a good question from Justin asks, how is this impacted for 1099 workers on a project? How would they certify? So if they truly are independent contractors and they have their own business, so they're not employees working for a company, they would have to do their own certified payroll reports. They'd show their own time worked and their, excuse me, their hourly rates of pay, their gross amount paid, and oops, way too far. Then on that second page, they're going to sign it themselves to show, yes, in fact, I did pay myself the appropriate prevailing wage rate. And obviously, they're not going to file a complaint on themselves if they didn't pay prevailing wage. But just as a caution, we have had complaints filed by unsuccessful bidders who said, I know this guy got the job because, well, usually it's not just this person is an independent contractor and they're not paying themselves prevailing wage, but it's more they aren't paying themselves prevailing wage and they have a bunch of their family members working on the project and aren't paying themselves prevailing wage. So even if they're the owner of a company, they would still have to pay themselves the appropriate prevailing wage rate. It goes back to that evening the playing field so everybody's bidding on equal footing. So that applies even if it's an owner or principal of a business. Ooh, Sherry asked another good question too. You guys have great questions. What if they work the last week of the month, but they're not paid until after the 5th business day of the following month? So in that case, that last week of the month, report that with the next month's payroll. So whatever they've been paid up through the 5th business day of the following month, that's what you would report for that month for payroll. So there'll be a little bit of a lag time with, sometimes that last week isn't paid until later. That's okay. It gets there in the end. It's fine to leave that on for the next time. Oh, actually, maybe here's where I can copy and paste some of these links. That'll be a fast way. So, if you did want to attend the 3-hour seminar, I actually do have one coming up on May 8th. That'll be the last one for the spring. We usually have our seminars in spring and fall, so we won't have any scheduled until fall rolls around again, unless if there's a demand for it where people are saying, oh, we really need some more information on these. I can always set one up like we did for this morning. That'll be fine to do. Just reach out and ask. I do have one about overtime that's on April 17th coming up. Oh, that's next Tuesday. Overtime on these projects is a little bit different where it's on a daily basis, usually after 8 hours a day. And then all hours on Saturdays and Sundays are always at overtime. So that might be different than what you've been used to with regular Oregon overtime, which is just after 40 hours in the work week. And then there's contacts for you. So I hope that you'll reach out to us if you do have questions. It's usually easier, I find, to get us by email. We also have this general PWR email because sometimes we're out. So if we are out, if you get a bounce back message from us, you might consider forwarding the email to that general email box because everybody checks that every day.
Susan, I think we had 2
Yeah.
additional questions come in since your last questions.
Thank you. I just noticed those. Rebecca said, if a company receives a grant that is federally funded, do the Oregon prevailing wage rate laws apply? That's such a good question. And this is another one of those nuanced things. The definition of funds of a public agency is anything that's in the custody and control of a public agency. And the definition of public agency is a state or local public agency. So state of Oregon, like BOLI and Oregon Department of Transportation, or cities, counties, school districts all around Oregon. So if this federal grant comes in and it's given to a state or local public agency, once they have custody and control of that, it meets the definition of funds of a public agency. So that's how originally a federal grant being given to a state or local agency will trigger the state laws. And who is considered a professional that would not get paid prevailing wage? That's a good question. Usually supervisors who are not performing any manual labor, so their job is more managerial in nature rather than manual or physical. They wouldn't be due prevailing wage. So if you did have an owner of the company who is never actually performing manual labor on the project site, they're not due prevailing wage. The same thing with, I'm sorry to say, the people who have to do the certified payroll, it's not easy, but they're not required to be prevailing wage because their work is considered to be more professional in nature. So they don't have to be paid prevailing wage. Although I'm not opposed to you going back to the company and saying, I found out I have to be paid prevailing wage for the certified payroll reports I'm preparing. It's just not actually required by law. If you have a specific type of duty that you were wondering about, let me know and I can speak to that. And oh, you know what? I'm gonna have to. So I'm still listening. I'm still paying attention. I'm just gonna try and cut and paste some of these links here. Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought another question came in. Let me know. Do you have any other questions?
One more just came in, Susan.
We'll see. I'm not sure if that's going to work. So Rebecca asked, we have cable pullers in an apprenticeship program. Ooh, that's a good question. Would they fall under the fiber optics installers or apprentices? So this is another nuanced one. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but if the cable pullers, if their program standards for their apprenticeship program allow them to install fiber optics, then you can just continue to pay them as an apprentice as you would in that apprenticeship program. If the work to install the fiber optics falls outside of what their apprenticeship training program calls for, then you'd have to pay them at the full limited energy electrician classification. Hopefully that makes sense. So that would be the time where you'd want to go back to the apprenticeship standards and take a look to see what duties that apprenticeship can perform. Oh, another good question from Christina. The prevailing wage rates only apply to the specific hours employees are doing the specific work. Yes, so it is just for work that's on the Peterborough project site itself that the employees have to be paid at the prevailing wage rate. I can't imagine this happening for this type of project, but we do have things called dedicated sites. If you were to set up, for example, a staging area somewhere close to the project site, and that is set up specifically for that project, that's considered part of the project site too. So that staging area, you would kind of think of it as an extension of the project site. Work would be paid prevailing wage there, as would the drive time back and forth. Outside of that, you don't have to pay prevailing wage for any work that's done off of the project site. So driving back and forth from your shop to the project site, for example, you don't have to pay prevailing wage for that. And if a laborer rode along to help load materials, no, they're not paid prevailing wage during transit, and the driver wouldn't be either. Did that link work? Exciting. Isn't it fun when technology actually works like it's supposed to? Okay, so let me see. This link is for your homepage. At least that's what I call it. And that's where you will find all these other links. So this is a great link to start with. From there, that's where you can find the link for the rates, that definitions book that we took a look at, coverage determinations, if that was something you wanted to submit to us, the seminar schedule, if you want to attend those upcoming seminars that we have. Here's the Peterborough Law Handbook. And you know how I mentioned that's such a big book, 209 pages. We pulled out the contractor responsibility section of it. So if you only want to focus on that, you could click on this link instead, and you don't have to scroll through all 200 pages. And then the forms that I'd mentioned, there is this public works bond form here. And then we have our certified payroll. We have one version that's an Excel version we looked at this morning was the fillable PDF version. And then those are the instructions there for completing it. So that's probably going to be the most helpful link for you.
So Susan, we're at time. On behalf of everyone here, I wanted to thank you for this. Clearly, there's a lot to prevailing wage and there are a lot of responsibilities. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you walking us through this. I may circle back and ask you if you're willing to kind of revisit this conversation and ask questions as we get further along in the process. But for everyone on the call, thanks for joining us again, recognizing that it was a quick turnaround time, but we had nearly 70 folks here, and I think that's pretty impressive. So thanks for being responsive. If you have an interest in further discussions like this, please let us know, and we'll get something on the books. And I will get Susan's slide deck, and we'll get it sent out to everyone so you all have access to it. With that, have a great day, and I'm sure I'll see a lot of you very soon. Oh, one last plug for the ISP still on the call. Totally different program. The BEAD challenge process kicks off tomorrow. So there's a webinar that we're hosting, 11 a.m. A lot of information from our consultants who will walk you through kind of generally what the challenge process in Oregon looks like, what you need to do on your end, and how it's all going to go down. So this is the beginning to this probably 4.5 month long process for specific to the BEAD program. So if you can, please join us. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Take
you.
care.